For more on how China and the UK are cooperating on clean energy, I spoke to Isabel Hilton, who's based in London. She's the founder and editor of Chinadialogue.net, an online publication focused on the environment and climate change. I started by asking her what areas of clean energy the two countries are cooperating on.
The UK is quite heavily invested in offshore wind, which is a big area of interest for China. They already have some cooperation on nuclear energy. China is a huge power in onshore wind, which is less popular here, but also in the production of solar panels. So there are already synergies. I think the areas in which there are still important breakthroughs yet to come are things like the storage capacity that we will need to have 100% renewables. The United Kingdom is phasing out its coal use. It's going to close down its last coal-fired power stations, but nevertheless retains an interest in carbon capture and storage, which of course for China, which is still the world's biggest user of coal, is hugely important. For Britain, it would be more in terms of industrial emissions.
China and the UK have been cooperating on building clean energy for a number of years. They've signed memorandum of understanding, and they've also had these annual dialogues. What sort of progress have we seen in the goals that they set out?
Well, I think that there is a lot of dialogue, if you like. There's a lot of dialogue in terms of coordination of policy. There's a lot of dialogue in terms of coordination in the diplomatic sphere. I think probably the main progress that I see is actually in the finance sector. You know, moving the trillions, as they say in the climate community, is going to be hugely important, because at the moment the relatively small proportion of global investment goes into low carbon technologies or into climate change at all. And until that changes, you know, we're really sort of struggling uphill. And this is an area in which, for example, the People's Bank of China and the City of London have a very active and interesting collaboration. It's very dynamic. It seems to, you know, be a field in which there is again a good synergy. London as a global financial centre, China with a lot of cash and perhaps less experience operating in global markets. So there's a growing market, for example, in green bonds, which China is very interested in. And in general, kind of low-carbon investment, designing low-carbon instruments for the climate change market.
We know there was some controversy over the French-led Hinkley Point nuclear power project, which China has a one-third stake in. What were the sticking points, and what sort of progress? Where are we now?
Where to begin? Hinkley is a very troubled project. As you know, this is a French technology, and there have been now this is the 5th attempt to build and operate this particular design. It started off in Finland, you know, 12 years ago now. That plant is still not online. Then there's one in Normandy, that's not online. 2 in China, that's not working either. And Hinkley Point. All of these are over time and over budget. So there is, first of all, a real problem with the technology. It's unpopular because of the cost. It's unpopular because actually it's never worked, and you know, we still don't really know if it's going to work, but in the meantime we're spending billions on it. It's unpopular because there are people who, of course, are opposed to nuclear power on principle, but also for practical reasons. Britain has a lot of very old nuclear power stations. You know, we're retiring the first generation of them. And the cleanup and decommissioning costs are absolutely staggering. Of course, there are people who say we can't tackle climate change without nuclear, so we should just get on with it. But for any government, this is a very sensitive area.
So Chinese and British researchers are teaming up on a number of projects, really focusing on the next generation of renewable energy tech. What might some of those initiatives look like?
I think there's a whole range of technologies, and climate change and renewable energies. It's going to be a diversity of technologies. Everything from waste to energy, which, you know, in theory solves 2 problems at once. Storage, as I said, is a huge one, and also demand reduction. You know, since 2005, Britain has saved the equivalent of 2 Hinkley Point power stations in demand reduction. Smart grid management is another one, because you can manage your grid in the peak loads. With intelligent grid management, you can get by with much less wastage of electricity. There are other things which are perhaps transitional technologies. Both countries are interested in shale gas extraction. Again, that's a relatively controversial one, certainly in the United Kingdom. Carbon capture, as I mentioned, is a big one. Market reform in China is going to be very important. At the moment, China is producing a great deal of renewable energy that can't get onto the grid. And that's all about the way the market operates in China and the kind of big blocks of energy which are committed to produced by, for instance, coal-fired power stations. So I think that actually market reform would do a tremendous amount in China for this transition.